Hey, Matt.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing great. Nice to be with you. Thanks for inviting me on.
Good to have you. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You're Matt Welch. It's been a while since you've been on Blogging Heads TV, Matt. What's the deal? What's
absolutely true? See, the thing is, in order to go somewhere, you have to be invited, Bob. This is the rule. The rule of parties. The rule of Blogging Heads.
See, I don't have parties, and maybe that's why I didn't really get the hang of this whole podcast thing.
Yeah,
you invite people, so you ask people to be on your show. Is that the way it works?
Yeah. It's very, very strange the way it goes. No, it's funny. I sometimes will be looking for some old piece of thing that I might have written back in the day, including about our subject du jour, John McCain, and I'll see a Blogging Heads conversation that happened so long ago that I don't even remember it. It's like, oh, there's me talking to Will Wilkinson. What's going on there? It's pretty funny.
Yeah. No, it's now been, how long has it been? It's been 13 years. 13 years. Wow. Amazing. No, wait. Yeah, that's right. 13 years. It's a true institution. And you were in early. You were one of our early guests. Maybe I should tell people exactly who you are. You're Matt Welch, editor-at-large at Reason. More relevantly for today's purposes, you're the author of an actual book about John McCain, Myth of a Maverick. And it's Tuesday, and McCain died on Friday. There is a tradition in American journalism in particular that you soft pedal criticism of famous people who've died for a decent interval. I mean, in Britain, it's very different. I mean, you can be giving very harsh appraisals, before the body has reached room temperature. But in America, we do have a decent interval. In terms of my rule of thumb for when it's okay to start just giving a candid appraisal, it's when the White House flag has been lowered at half-mast, raised again, and then lowered again. That's my rule of thumb.
Yeah, that's usually the time that comes.
Do you think we're good?
I had this feeling in watching the reaction to all of this, and we had an obit. Obviously, he's been dying for a long time, so we prepared it in advance, like everybody else did. That I wrote both in terms of words and in video form, and it was very critical of his policies while being respectful of a lot of his other qualities, and it was a mix. And I've seen a lot of people, including our friend Jack Schaefer, who wrote an uncharacteristically off piece that appeared yesterday, I believe, in Politico.
I didn't read it. Was it extremely charitable?
It was complaining that we're not allowed to criticize John McCain.
Oh, yeah.
You know what? I criticize John McCain fine. And the only people who are really getting mad at me are people who wanted me to criticize him more. And who there's this feeling like, oh, I'm being told I can't criticize him, says the person on social media being retweeted 1,000 times. It's like, right. It's kind of sounds like to me you're criticizing him. So why don't you just criticize him and stop complaining about this meta thing that isn't happening? And I think interesting to the subject matter itself and to John McCain, if you look at pieces by Mark Salter, his longtime co-author and kind of alter ego, if you look at even the Twitter feed of his own son, Jack McCain, they will all say he was a flawed man. They will criticize him. John McCain criticized himself every single time he opened his mouth. He always said that he fell short of the ideals that he had wanted. He was a flawed human being, but hopefully he put himself or put his country higher than himself. So it's just this weird thing that people complain that you can't criticize about a person who is criticizing himself. So just go for it is my advice to all human beings.
In that case, we will exit the meta stage of this conversation and get into the actual conversation. I mean, there's one mildly meta question I have, which is, of course, with mainstream media, I mean, I haven't been watching cable TV news as it happens in the wake of this. I assume, first of all, it's been like a ton of coverage. Secondly, largely, I'm sure, charitable and laudatory. One question is, do you think he's getting better coverage, his death, that he's getting better coverage and his death is getting more coverage by virtue of the fact that Trump is president and by virtue of McCain's relationship to Trump and what he is thought to represent in contrast to Trump? I mean,
of course. I mean, and also keep in mind, So here's a guy who was the media's favorite Republican for the last 25 years, right? With the exception of maybe 11 months in 2008 when it kind of went sideways on that. But for the most part, he and there's a lot of reasons for that. He's one of them. I mean, he referred to the media as his base, but he comes from the same kind of class of people. This is not very well understood about his biography, but whenever his father, who was a Navy admiral and an important person, whenever he was stateside, he would basically live in Washington. He was a liaison on Capitol Hill. John McCain grew up with historians, with journalists, with senators at the kitchen table, slinging the bull. So he understands the class mores of this. Think about what that class, the sort of DC establishment, which it's a crude overgeneralization, but let's just go with it for a second. Think about how that class of people has felt since about July of 2015. They've been bummed. They hate Trump. And when I say they, I should say we, although, I don't exactly live there and don't share every single bit of these values. But the establishment has been reeling in the face of Donald Trump because he's such an anti-establishment candidate, because all of the manners, the mores, the habits, everything, the norms, right, that they have held on to, for good and for ill, he's been smashing like a bull in a china shop. So, with John McCain passing, it's an opportunity to sort of express this, collective lamentation, that this old way of being is kind of dwindling, is kind of on the run, and the new way is still with us and still making people feel bad. So I think that really, really colors the way that everyone is covering McCain as he passes, in addition to the usual American, let's say nice things about everybody, including Richard Nixon when he dies.
Yeah. Now, in terms of the way McCain became the darling of the media, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I hadn't really thought of this, but I mean, first of all, military office. I mean, McCain was descended from military royalty virtually. While he was in Vietnam, his father was what? He was overseeing the whole Pacific Fleet or something?
Yeah. Beginning in, I think July of 1968, he was the head of the Pacific Command. So he was basically prosecuting the war, including, overseeing the bombing of Hanoi while his son was captive there. Just imagine.
Yeah. And I think one thing people may not realize is that in the military, beyond a certain rank, you may well become, in effect, a politician as much as a military person. And his father probably is an example of that. And I'm sure he did go to school in terms of, McCain did, in terms of understanding journalists and so on. But it occurred to me that there's something he has in common with Trump. And it's this. It's kind of obscure, but if you ask, when Trump was running, and he would say these things that struck us as crazy. People like you and me, it's like no politician's ever said anything like this. This is crazy. And at first, it took me a while to get the fact that that's why his base liked it, because it meant he was not a regular politician. McCain did a little of that. He said things that politicians don't normally say to reporters. It was different. He wasn't just being crazy, outlandish the way Trump was, but he was going beyond the bounds of normal politician journalist discourse in a way that established his authenticity, in the way to establish him as being something other than a robotic politician, right?
I think there's a very good point in that. I would sort of shade it or amend it to say that Trump did that in a kind of unmediated way directly to the American people. Right. He did that because, people would every cable network had his feed on for about a year and a half there. Mm-hmm. And so he would say these crazy things while people were watching at home, or he would tweet these crazy things and he would get right into the skulls of individual humans. John McCain, and you see this a lot in the mid 90s reporting when everyone's really starting to fall for him. And I mean, literally fall for him. The kind of things that Michael Lewis, for example, wrote about him for the New Republic are saying things like, I think I know what it's like finally to be a teenage girl having her first crush. I mean, it was literal. Like, I'm falling for him. I think I might be a Republican. And a lot of the anecdotes that caused people to come to that conclusion were he was saying these unguarded things to reporters. And you've seen this. You could see scores of examples of them saying, I wanted to reach out and tell him, no, you have to stop saying that. You're not supposed to say those things to reporters. So reporters, of course, felt like, wow, I'm part of a little bit part of a special club. But it was also, you're right, refreshing to see him say that. When he first ran for president against George W. Bush as an underdog, he relished those things. So he was saying all kinds of stuff that Republicans aren't supposed to say. He would say, make jokes about the religious right. He's like, the old joke, the religious right, it's neither, right? He was referred to the Bush campaign as the Death Star, all these kind of things. Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson are agents of intolerance. He would say these things, and importantly, these are things that many reporters also believe. So that kind of helped it be so refreshing. But also the Republicans were assumed to not be able to say and win an election. And in fact, of course, he didn't win the election in 2000, and he changed his tone on precisely those things when he ran again this time to win in 2008. And so the way that 11-month period where people kind of fell out of love with John McCain, and in fact, it started a little bit before that, is when he began sending those signals out that guy, the 99-2000 guy that so many people first fell for in the press, was not quite going to be the same here. And as Jon Stewart said to him in an interview, I believe in 2006, like, you're not going to go to crazy baseland, are you? And McCain had this kind of look in his eye, like, well, yeah, I am.
Yeah. Well, and of course, Sarah Palin was in his future, unbeknownst to us. But let's back up and talk a little more about his kind of youth. I mean, as you said, it was in a sense a childhood of privilege, but he had a, shall we say, mischievous streak from early on, right?
Holy cow! Yes, I mean, you always hear these stories of or kind of intimations that he had this anger problem because of his captivity in Vietnam. No, his mom was putting him in a bathtub full of ice at age 2 because he was screaming. He's always been a rebellious.
Is that true?
Yeah, it's true.
Is that a recommended therapy?
I don't think so, but I'm not going to get on the wrong side of Roberta McCain, who was still with us at age 106.
Yeah.
So he had a nickname in high school. He was going to a prep school in Alexandria, Virginia. He led a group, I think that was called the Bad Bunch at the time. His nicknames were McNasty and something else. At Annapolis, very famously, he graduated 894th out of 899. There's reason, I think, to believe that he might not have stayed in if his name hadn't been John Sidney McCain III, kind of helped out. But he was constantly going over the walls. He was boozing, drinking, smoking, chasing skirts. This was who he was. And interestingly, since his story, I think, his life story as transmitted through Faith of My Fathers is kind of about how that guy had that rebellious, punky kid, after being broken in Vietnam, by torture, realized that his individualism was a kind of a dead end, and he needed to restore his faith by looking to sort of the higher power of American nationalism. That said, that rebellious, punky, maverick, McNasty guy, I think, helped him resist torture and led him become a leader of men in Vietnam. He was incredibly defiant in Vietnam. The most famous time being the Christmas 1968. They kind of wheeled everybody out of their dark rooms and had a made for propaganda kind of Christmas gathering of prisoners. And they were all told, shush, shush, shush. And the first thing McCain does is turn to the next guy standing next to him, who he's never seen. It's like, I'm John McCain. This is my name, rank, and serial number. How the hell are you? Oh, look, there's a camera. Beep! And he just started like dropping F-bombs, and they're like, McCain, shut up. And he didn't give a flying anything. And everyone, the whole thing like descended into chaos, and everyone took incredible spirit from that. I think partly of that is just the cuss that he was growing up, the kind of rebel spirit 50s guy, led to that and stayed with him, that irascibility streak. I mean, right now, this week, everyone's going to talk about what a conciliatory bipartisan figure he was, and he definitely had those aspects, but he was also a son of a bitch, again, admittedly by his own terms. I mean, he was calling Rand Paul a stooge of the Kremlin as recently as a couple months ago. So he's able to say and act in a pretty irascible and not always certainly pleasant way. And it's part of this mix of why we both like him and have reason to question some of his activities.
So back up. So he says he had a kind of a come to Jesus moment, and he's saying it was when he realized he needed to rededicate his life to some kind of purpose.
After being broken in Vietnam, right? He's tortured. He keep in mind he came to, by all accounts, he came into the Hanoi Hilton in worse physical shape than anyone had. He'd broken 2 arms, he'd broken a leg, or his knee was mangled. They stabbed him in the foot with a bayonet. He was down, he was racked with dysentery. He was down to 100 pounds. After his initial kind of processing and some ham-handed surgery, they wheeled him into a room with Bud Day and Norris Overley, and their comment was they didn't think he was going to survive the night. He looked that bad. So they kind of nursed him back to health. So after all of that, so he starts off in a pretty bad place. Then they realize after his father is promoted to the command, they got a live one here. It'd be great propaganda to have him accept early release. And he says no, he refuses to do it. And then they start torturing him in earnest. In addition to all the mad treatment that they've done and the kind of beatings, they start doing the rope treatments. And imagine you've had your arms broken recently and you didn't really have good medical care. Now we're going to tie your arms behind your back, putting you in a terrible position in rope torture for days on end. He broke. And almost every single Vietnam POW at some point broke. You were supposed to, by the code of conduct, resist to the best of your ability, to the point of escaping. But he taped a confession that he was a black criminal. It's these confessions that are so obviously not in English, that
black criminal has a different connotation in America, right?
Yeah, I don't think that's where they were going with it, but who knows what was happening in North Vietnam. So anyways, when he came back to his cell, as he reports it, he contemplated suicide, perhaps even put a shirt on a windowsill with an intention to hang himself. So he was really broken down, and his fellow prisoners kind of like talked him off the ledge and brought him back and reminded him that there's a cause greater than himself that he needs to keep and fight. And so in his telling in Faith of My Fathers, which was released in 1998, kind of as it accomplished 2 things. It's kind of a campaign document, right? It's right before he's running for president. So that's helpful. Most of his books were released in convenient order for his political career. But it was also his attempt to make some meaning out of his experience. Mm-hmm. And we might get into some of that later, because I think it's pretty fascinating. It affects his foreign policy views, actually. But from that point on, especially from prison and from and being released, but really especially from 1998, after the exercise of making it trying to make sense out of it, this becomes the central theme of his rhetorical politics, is serving a cause greater than himself. Every single statement you'll see from him, including one that his family released yesterday, his final statement, that's what he's talking about. And he frames that he learned post-torture in Vietnam.
Yeah. I just heard a snippet of an interview with him when he was describing being shot down. He had been badly injured by the crash. Then he gets on the ground and like the North Vietnamese are surrounding him and continuing to beat the hell of him. And he said, they were understandably angry. And I thought that was, that spoke well of him. I guess it's kind of hard to, in reflecting on it, to imagine that people you've been bombing wouldn't be angry. At the same time, I thought that was a good little piece of perspective.
He was always had a great sense of humor about things, and had a genuine sense of conciliation. I mean, it's not for nothing. One of his most serious kind of accomplishments as a politician is that he, along with John Kerry, were instrumental in restoring diplomatic relations with Vietnam. They held a series of hearings on Capitol Hill about the POW MIA issue, not without controversy, but they held these hearings, which were understood to be as an important precursor to any kind of rapprochement with Vietnam. And he was out there. His very good friend was installed as the first ambassador to Vietnam. He went and ended up befriending is too strong a word, but engaging in relations with some of his former captors. So he was able to, imagine that. 5.5 years of your life, you've seen horrible things done to your friends, to yourself, and other things, but he was still able to kind of bury the hatchet with them in a way that led directly to peace. So that does speak well of both his kind of humor and distancing temperament, which is helpful and inspirational.
Yeah. On the point of his having a transformation while captive, that's totally plausible to me. I mean, in my experience, much milder forms of trauma get people to just really reassess, like, what's the message here? What should I do? And I can only imagine. I mean, that's an experience well beyond anything I hope I'll ever experience. And just to kind of underscore what a screw up he had been up until that point. Am I right that even in the Air Force, he was like crashing planes and stuff? I mean, before he was shot down, you didn't have to shoot him down. He would crash the plane for you, right?
He was in the Navy, as a naval aviator, and I think the count is he crashed 5 planes. And that's kind of a lot.
That's mind blowing. I mean,
that's a lot of planes.
He would have been totally out of the service if his father hadn't been who he was, right?
I think there's reason to suspect that. I don't want to make it a complete declaration because I'm not sure I know the exact protocol for serial plane crashers and people who carouse at every single opportunity with Brazilian heiresses and Mamie, the Flame of Florida, and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, he cut a swath for sure and was reckless. He was even part of something, and you'll see some conspiracy theorizing about this that I think is groundless, but the biggest naval disaster in history, up until arguably ever, in terms of not being attacked, as the Forrestal fire in 1967 on an aircraft carrier, where a rocket or a bomb on a plane on an aircraft carrier fell down, and there was sort of a fire. 134 servicemen died. He was right there, right next to all of that happening at the same time. So trouble followed the guy for sure everywhere he was. He definitely was a screw up. After he came back from Vietnam, however, he did some kind of heroic redoubling of his efforts. He got a command of a naval post, and he had to learn how to fly again. And his body's mangled. Physically, you have to pass all of these tests, and you have to have certain flexion in your knee, which had been destroyed. You had to do this and that. And he worked in grueling hours with a physical therapist in order to qualify again. And he was seen, for the most part, as being a pretty good commander there. And so there was definitely some growing up that happened. But the most interesting change, I think, that took place was not in two interesting things, and they're related. One is that he came back in 1973 to a country that was divided, and he engaged in a long series of kind of readings at the Naval War College to kind of figure out what the hell happened in Vietnam. Why does this turn out to be such a fiasco? He read the Pentagon Papers, which is ironic because he had also agreed to testify against Daniel Ellsberg in the trial. But he read that. He read Best and the Brightest and a bunch of other things. And he came to some conclusions that the leadership was wrong in many different ways. America didn't explain what it was doing, a lot of different things. But as a politician and as a public person, from that point on till about 1997-ish, right around the time he's completing Faith of My Fathers, he is what, on foreign policy, you could describe him as kind of a Vietnam syndrome realist.
Right.
His father and his grandfather were totally Teddy Roosevelt's Navy American supremacists in every single sense. Like, America is going to keep the world's shipping lanes free for commerce. We are the world's superpower. We're going to take the mantle of the British Empire. It's going to be us. They believe that in their core. He believed that in his core until, understandably, his experience in Vietnam. So he is a skeptic of Ronald Reagan sending Marines to Beirut. He is a skeptic of Bill Clinton's kind of military adventuring in Haiti and Somalia and elsewhere. He gave a speech in 94, I think it was, saying the worst thing that he could imagine is American boots on the ground in Yugoslavia. And yet, by the end of the 90s, by 1997, 1998, as he's completing Faith of My Fathers, as he's running for president, he flips. He becomes the most important, most persuasive hawk in the U.S. Senate. And it's very interesting. This is one of the two main puzzles that I had when I was kind of grappling with him as a public figure. Like, what happened? Why did this happen? And you can actually get it in the last page or the last 2 pages of Faith of My Fathers, which I only really understand by listening to the books on audio tape as I was driving around following him on the campaign trail. You can tell the parts that he wrote and the parts that Mark Salter wrote. Mark Salter is, is a very, very good writer and gifted, and it's not always easy to separate the two. But the tone of McCain's voice, and he has this line, this kind of conclusion at the end of the book, saying, for a long time, America lost her confidence, in itself and the righteous use of our power and these kind of things. Those days are now over. Thankfully, we can all go forward. So he had healed Vietnam, right? He'd restored diplomatic relations. He'd made sense of his senseless captivity and his participation in a war that was in many, regards senseless, or at least, flawed, made peace with it, seen also, and this is, to be understood, seen also that the applications of American power went better than expected in places like the Gulf War and Yugoslavia, better than projected. And he came out of that raring to go. He was restored back into the McCain family faith in a Teddy Roosevelt style foreign policy. And from that moment on, it was game on in a way that I think people didn't really, still, I think, really haven't fully grappled with. He was for preemptive war 4 years before it ever occurred to George W. Bush. He had a very radical notion of interventionism that sustained him until his dying days. So
you're putting the point of transition when, like
97, 98.
97. So that's right after the Bosnia intervention.
Yes, and before Kosovo. Recall in 1999, he showily suspended his campaign so that he could go to Washington and support Bill Clinton, which is a very minority position in the Republican Party. Remember, the GOP in the 90s was pretty hesitant about nation building, wars of choice, these kind of words that were epithets back then. So he was not just supporting Clinton, but saying Clinton needs to go farther than he does. So he suspended his campaign to go say this. He'd say, I'd rather lose a campaign than lose a war. And the press swooned over this display of patriotism, although it was also served his ambition very directly. So yes, it happens right in that point. He gives a speech in, I believe, March of 1999. In Kansas, unveiling this doctrine that he called rogue state rollback. He basically laid out the axis of evil at the time, North Korea, Iran, Iraq, in which he said what America needs to do is identify with, sympathize with people who are struggling against tyranny abroad, which, great. I sympathize them, and I want to give my moral support to those people as well. But here's the catch. We need to supply them whenever possible with arms. And once we cross that threshold with them, if they are cracked down by their governments, we need to back them up in war. We can't just have these kind of gestures of solidarity that aren't backed up with the full might of American power. And it was alarming to me. And it's one of the reasons why I wrote the book. This is a pretty radical doctrine of interventionism, arguably the most interventionist policy or campaign foreign policy by any serious presidential candidate. And you didn't hear about it too much in 1999 and 2000 because people were talking about what a maverick he was. They were talking about his incredible, dazzling biography, and understandably so, but there wasn't actually an examination of how there was a through line with his political ideology. And part of that ideology was very Teddy Rooseveltian and very military interventionist in a way. And keep in mind, I mean, a lot of people, and when I say he's sort of an influential or persuasive hawk, a lot of liberal hawks, remember those guys who were supported the Iraq
They're
war?
Still around so far as I know.
Right. So who did they trust? In 2002, they didn't trust Dick Cheney. They didn't trust George W. Bush. They trusted John McCain. John McCain was the guy who, right after September 11th, he was kind of the national uncle to make us feel better about what happened. He would go on the late night talk shows. He would go on Face the Nation and whatnot. Always the most mediagenic politician in the country on some level. He would make it all right. So if John McCain said we needed to do this, there are a whole lot of people in the media, there are a whole lot of liberal hawks who said, okay, he's convinced me, I'll do it for his reasons, not for whatever dumb thing that George W. Bush said. And I think he helped move the center of foreign policy gravity in America towards a much more default kind of
interventionist, let's use sanctions, let's do this type of threshold. And I think that is not a positive legacy that we'll look back on happily 20, 50 years from now.
Yeah. And of course, this became, this is a big part of the neoconservative rationale for wars. We're intervening. We're changing regimes and whatever on behalf of the oppressed people. Of course, it's inevitably selectively applied when we have brutal authoritarians who are our allies. We see reasons not to invade the countries, but I want to be clear on what your explanation is, because it sounds like your explanation for the change of heart is relatively lacking in cynicism. And you don't seem to be emphasizing political calculation. I mean, you're saying he realized, well, this can work. Bosnia worked. And actually, I mean, it actually is true. I actually supported the Bosnia intervention. In part, I was at the New Republic at the time, and I remember we had Strobe Talbot, who was Deputy Secretary of State, to lunch, and he was clearly in the throes of Vietnam syndrome. And one thing he had not counted on, I think, was the importance of the new bombing technology, which allowed you to be much more surgical. The other thing is, in Bosnia, we had a highly motivated, cohesive ethnic group on our side on the ground, and there were a lot of differences but I think Strobe Talbot was at that point still a little too traumatized from Vietnam to appreciate reasons it might work out a little more cleanly in Bosnia. So I can well understand that somebody might just, after Bosnia and Kosovo. I didn't support Kosovo because, for one thing, it actually didn't have Security Council authorization, and I'm the world's only advocate of international law, so far as I can tell. But I can see that explanation. But is that the explanation? That's your only explanation? You don't see much political calculation here?
I mean, he always, and again, this is something that he serially admits throughout his books. He frequently let his political ambition steer him, sort of warp him, distort him, sometimes cause him to say things that he knew weren't true. The famous case of this is in South Carolina in 2000, in his remarks over the Confederate flag. He initially criticized it being flown, and then after he was getting a lot of pushback, and it looked like South Carolina was the key primary here, George W. Bush was on the other side of it. Then McCain, showily pulls out a crumpled hostage note and reads from it, "I think that it is a symbol of tradition and people should decide for their own selves," kind of thing. And then later he apologizes for this in South Carolina after he loses the primary, and he writes about it in this book, Worth the Fighting For. So he had done this. He has admitted this. So I'm not, and again, when he suspended his campaign in 1999 to support Kosovo, I am not holding this out as a purely, generous and patriotic gesture. I think he understood. I mean, as Bill Kristol, I believe, or David Brooks, and they were kind of indistinguishable back then, wrote as McCain won the first GOP primary by that move. So people were applauding and saying, we need someone like that. He derived direct political benefit from that. As he derived direct political benefit from the fact that Faith in My Fathers, which is a very good book, I recommend it, came out right as he was running for president. So that's all free media, and it all redounds well on him. However, I do believe that it is a sincere shift, and it makes plausible sense. Imagine you believe this forever, your family believes this forever, and then you take this incredible hit, personally, physically, and then you come back, you see a divided country, you see a lost war, and you read up on it. You're probably going to have a little bit of that faith shaken. And it reflects the way that he talked about foreign policy going forward. He believed still and would talk glowingly about America being the shining city on the hill and all that kind of stuff. But he was really, really hesitant about the use of force, unless we had overwhelming public support for it, and a lot of other things that now, make a lot more sense to me than later McCain does. The country, you say that you supported Bosnia and didn't support Kosovo. I was living in Eastern Europe at the time in Prague, and ran a newspaper. We covered the Yugoslav war in every single edition of our newspaper. We had people embedded in Sarajevo. I saw the fecklessness of European leadership at the time, and there's this moment where America didn't know what to do. Thought maybe we can let Europe kind of sort it out. Europe wow, did they bungle everything that they sort of touched. And I supported the intervention in Bosnia. Not only that, I supported it in Kosovo as well. I've come to regret the Kosovo one in particular. But you could see how people moved in that direction, how the overall move went there, because there's a sense of the Cold War vacuum created a vacuum and nothing filled it. So something needs to here, and then people start to apply it inconsistently going forward. So McCain was part of that. He sort of surfed that wave, but I think that he, for the most part, got there from a genuine position. But he couldn't help notice, I am equally sure, that there is no penalty for going on Face the Nation and saying America needs to be tough, and saying that, he was talking about annihilating North Korea or very close to that kind of language. In 1994, he was using the phrase existential threat to describe any number of regimes or any number of foreign policy troubles for the last 20 years. And you don't really face a sanction for doing that. You're seen as someone who's, hey, look, he cares about the problem. He's pressing the world's biggest do something button. That's good. Journalists generally like that, and they don't spend enough time thinking about, what are the negative implications of that? What are the, besides the nice motivation, if it is indeed a nice motivation, let's give the benefit of the doubt here. What happens when you do it? So what happens when you intervene in Libya to stop a massacre in Benghazi in 2011? Well, a lot of people were end zone dancing on that, and Marie Slaughter comes to mind in 2011. Doesn't look so good in retrospect, right? So, but the people who went there and advocate for this, and McCain was central among those, Lindsey Graham is someone who's always on there as well. They're not really called to task on that very much by our modern media for whatever reason. Yes.
No, they're running the country. I mean, if you look at people who have championed, I'm not talking about people in government so much, but in terms of people who are like running the media establishment, the people who have championed the most ill-advised foreign policy misadventures of the last 15, 20 years have all gotten either promotions or they've stayed in the influential positions they're in.
I mean, think about Hillary Clinton in the Democratic Party. Who is a bigger hawk than Hillary Clinton in the Democratic Party? It's hard to come up with one. I mean, Joe Lieberman's no longer in the Democratic Party necessarily, but she was campaigning in 2016 as the Libya intervention, which she was the most influential person behind, as an occasion of smart power at its best. She used that phrase over and over again in 2016. That was not smart power at its best. No. It just wasn't. But she wasn't even worried about that, about making that position, and she wasn't really challenged that much in the media. There's a default sense of robust interventionism in the media that does not get enough attention, I do not believe, especially the national political press.
Yeah, no, it's, I think I'll plug at this point, we can link to this, a piece I wrote for The Intercept a few months ago about the New York Times' coverage of Iran and kind of like hyping the threat. So you mentioned Bill Kristol. And of course, Kristol and McCain, became, I guess you could say, allies. Kristol, famously championed the, as it happened, disastrous choice of, Sarah Palin as vice president. Were the neocons like Kristol, were they cultivating McCain early around the time of his transition?
Yes. And that was part of the story. In 1997, Bill Kristol and David Brooks wrote a piece. I believe it first appeared in the Wall Street Journal, championing this thing that they christened national greatness conservatism.
Right.
Which was, enough of this kind of Newt Gingrich, sense of balancing budgets and the government is the problem and that kind of thing. No, what we need is the government to rally us around a new grand project. We had one during the Cold War, which is fighting communism, which is an ideological struggle in addition to kind of a military alliance struggle. And that was really great. But now we need a new one to look at future threats and just to kind of bind us all together in a grand patriotic project. They harkened back to Teddy Roosevelt again as the avatar of this or inspiration of this. And their modern example of the person who would embody that was John McCain. And so there started to be this kind of revolving door between the Weekly Standard, which is the magazine that they had started in the 90s, and McCain campaign staff. It became very difficult to figure out where one ended and one began. And so McCain started brushing up on his Teddy Roosevelt back then, and it started to be a great mind meld. It's very curious to me that when we use the word neoconservative, we think of Paul Wolfowitz, we think of Dick Cheney, we think of a lot of people. In many senses, in our political world, the person who embodied it the most was John McCain. He tried to distance himself from that in 2008 because he could see that the term was toxic. Yet there's really no kind of definition you can come up with of neoconservative that he doesn't embody in almost every sense. And the people who we most identify in the journalistic sphere as that, he was their guy. And it's really interesting. There's a great piece I recommend people look for, Franklin 4, in 2001 in the summer. So right before 9/11. He writes this piece. I forget the title of it, and it's not that easy to find online. But it's about what happened to kind of the neocons there. Where are they in the summer of 2001? Where is John McCain? Where are these people? And at that moment, they were thinking about starting a third party. They were disaffected. Remember, George W. Bush runs on a more humble foreign policy.
As a realist. And Dick Cheney, so far as we knew at that point, was a realist. He was among the people who had said during the Persian Gulf War, no, don't go all the way to Baghdad. That'll be a mess.
Right. And so... you have these people who are looking to leave. I think like registered bullmoose.org, Marshall Whitman, some other guys, were kind of wandering in this direction. They were off the political reservation. They were thinking about looking for, and this applies to domestic policy too. Part of the national greatness things is like, let's identify, and this is something that McCain definitely did at the time. Let's identify as our greatest domestic enemy, cynicism. So anything that makes us more cynical about government is getting in the way of our natural kind of patriotism and sense that America is really great. So what is it that's making us cynical? Well, campaign finance, right? We look at our politics and we see that these politicians don't do what they're saying they're going to do. It's probably because of lobbyists or the corruption of campaign finance. So let's go after that in the name of eradicating cynicism. So in all of McCain's speechcraft, rhetoric going forward, that becomes central to it. Even and the smallest things like steroids in baseball. Look at the rhetoric that John McCain and others used. The problem with it is that it made people cynical about their own sport, their own heroes, and that itself is bad. So what can we do about that? Well, let's drug test high school athletes. Like what? The responses to this often led McCain in particular, but also those people in that period, to some pretty like freedom inhibiting things from my admittedly libertarian point of view.
So was campaign finance reform an early part of the neocon agenda as well at that point?
I think it's an early part of McCain's genuine agenda, and this arises a lot of it out of the Keating 5 scandal.
Right. So he was implicated in that. He was the only of the 5. They were all senators, I think, and the other 4 bit the dust. Right. I mean, the idea had been that there was this big S&L collapse, and in retrospect, it turned out that McCain and some other people had gone to bat for this donor named Keating, who had been funneling money into their campaigns. So there were hearings about it and everything. McCain survived, but it was after that he took up campaign finances as big. Yes. Of course, McCain Feingold is the legacy. As it happens, it didn't work out. I guess it wasn't upheld. Did it pass and was not upheld in the courts or something? Is that it?
Yeah, it was the law of the land, Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 1990 or 2002 or 3 or whatever it was. Mm-hmm. It was passed, and that was like a legislative achievement in terms of it was difficult to get it through. It was struck down by the Supreme Court, and I believe rightly so, on First Amendment grounds, because in the Citizens United case, which is now a litmus test for most Democrats, you have to say that Citizens United was bad, but the case itself was over a documentary, a hit piece documentary on Hillary Clinton, and whether, according to the law, it could not air on certain outlets because of the application of the law. So the law required there to be censorship of political documentary, which is kind of a pretty serious deal. And in the oral arguments, you recall, they asked the lawyer defending it, like, can we use the logic to censor books? I'm like, yeah, maybe. So that wasn't a good hour. But yes, John McCain's penchant for campaign finance reform as an important existential issue, came directly out of the Keating 5 scandal. We should not just gloss over, not accusing you of that, but let's dwell for a second on the Keating 5 thing itself. Charles Keating, swashbuckling, banker, Patriots, Republican guy, was John McCain's single biggest political benefactor in Arizona politics in the 1980s. There wasn't anyone who came particularly close. McCain, for decades after the Keating 5 scandal, which he hated, thought that expressed that he was being unfairly targeted because he was Republican. What McCain did was he intervened twice, I believe, with regulators who were looking into Keating's bank, and saying, hey, look, can you, hurry it up? And he's a good guy and that kind of stuff. That was sort of an unusual, intervention. So for years, he thought that, hey, look, you're just making me a scapegoat. And it was only in his book, Hard Call, which came out, I think right before the 2008 campaign, he finally kind of copped to doing it. He said, I have to admit that I let my ambition get the best of me. I intervened on behalf of a campaign contributor. It was my fault. So it took him 20 years, kind of like it took him almost 20 years to admit that the Iraq War was a mistake, which he does in his recent book. So anyways, after that, he learns two lessons. One is that, let's go after campaign finance as a big, issue. The other lesson, and this is intertwined with it, is let's just talk to reporters until they run out of questions. That's what he physically did at the big press conference, kind of in the midst or at the tail end of this whole thing. He's like, all right, here's the mother of all document dumps. Go through it. Ask me every question. What he realized is that, hey, look, I got pretty good press if I just leave myself open to all of this. And so it's kind of an aha moment for him, that sort of unfettered access is going to be his ally. Plus, journalists, for the most part, really like campaign finance reform, or at least did back in that day. And so it's kind of a good two-for issue for him going forward. Unfortunately, I think for the country, it introduced First Amendment protections against government infractions on political speech. And by the time 2008 campaign comes up, he doesn't talk about it at all, because the conservative base hates him for this. They're always treated him with an arm's length kind of disregard that you can even see this week here. A lot of conservatives are not joining the national mourning for John McCain, and that was one of the reasons why the grassroots really hated McCain-Feingold.
Yeah. Now, of course, liberals, when they list the things about McCain they liked, that's one of the things they liked by and large. Another one that probably a lot of people like, certainly liberals, is his position on torture. And you wrote a New York Times op-ed piece on this recently that we can link to. I mean, it's funny. Both of those things grow very directly out of his own traumas. Yeah. It's fair to say that had he not been tortured himself, there's no particular reason to believe he'd be famous for opposing torture. And similarly with campaign finance, that was rooted in his life experience. Not that that's a knock. I mean, everything people do, good or bad, has some kind of roots in their experience. And had they not had the lives they had, and things would have been different. But would you say that those are, what would you say are his finest moments? I think you'd certainly now as you're a libertarian, you're not with him on you do believe that the courts rightly saw tension between, yes, campaign finance reform and the First Amendment. On the other hand, I think you totally applaud his position on torture. What are his finest kind of moments from your point of view?
So the aforementioned kind of healing of Vietnam, right? Of taking, and this, he did this on a personal level too, in a way that's pretty interesting. When he came back from Vietnam, he wrote a 15,000 word piece for U.S. News and World Report about his experiences there. It was his first attempt at kind of applying some meaning and explaining the stories that happened there. And it was pretty interesting in that he was conciliatory even back then about draft dodgers, about most people. He was still bent out of shape by the peace delegations of the Jane Fondas of the world who would go off and look at the Potemkin prison conditions and declare that it was all good. He was understandably a little bit pissed off about that. But almost everybody else who's part of the domestic split over Vietnam, he was very magnanimous towards it. I was fighting for your freedoms is kind of how he would put it. And this is also part of his relationship with a lot of reporters, because that generation of reporters, many of them personally opposed Vietnam. Some of them like found a way not to serve and these kind of things. And so they were awkward around him, and he was a conduit to kind of make that okay and would have conversations with that. There's quite a few, he writes about this in several of his books, of people who were pretty famous. He was with John Kerry, famously, who's going to be the last person to die for a mistake. Those two are attached at the hip when it comes to the POW MIA hearings and restoring relations with Vietnam. This, I think, is a very important and very American push that he did. The torture thing also, and I would just highlight that he opposed torture, the kind of post 9/11 aspects of it in real time, right after Osama bin Laden is captured and killed, and everyone is just high-fiving each other and talking about how this is all because we were able to waterboard Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. McCain, in the moment, said, even if that's true, and I don't think that it is, it would still be immoral, and here's why. So he made both the moral case against torture and also the kind of consequentialist or pragmatic case against it too, which is that, look, people are going to break. They're going to tell you what you want to hear. The intelligence is not good. And he did it in real time. I think that is definitely an accomplishment. Mm-hmm. The other part is maybe less an individual piece of legislation or anything else, but there's a spirit to him, a generosity. And again, he was an irascible son of a bitch too, and would be mean to people. But that spirit, and a lot of people are going to be pointing at it this week. For instance, when he was on the campaign trail in 2008, and that kind of crazy woman comes up to him and starts babbling about how Barack Obama's he's an Arab, he's a this, he's a that, and he just kind of takes the mic and says, no, man, he's a decent American. He had that sense of decency, of not wanting to go. It's an elitist in a non-pejorative sense of the word. He had an elitist disdain for populist bigotry. And he was never in his, not never, that's too strong, but he was rarely shy in his career about speaking out against that. The times that he was shy about it is when he faced an election that he thought he really needed to win. So his lowest moments inversely come like in 2010, he was running a contested primary where he thought it was contested against an anti-immigration nut job named J.D. Hayworth. And that's when McCain does his, we need to complete the danged fence ad about immigration and all the terrible thing that illegal immigrants are doing in southern Arizona. So his record was not spotless on this, but he had this sort of a sense of a decency towards his fellow American, a sense that, look, we can disagree in a raucous sense on the Senate floor and elsewhere in our politics, but we're going to come together as Americans. We're not going to be intentionally divisive on basis of kind of essential differences between us. That's not the American way. I think that's a good spirit and a decent one, and it contrasts with the kind of Trump phenomenon in a useful way. So I think people, when they look back at him, they're going to, it's kind of, like a lot of America's founding myths, or it's the vision of the shining city on the hill. It's more ideal than it is necessarily always lived out in practice. But he was always pointing towards, we should act better, even if I'm not. And we should do that in a way that is decent and patriotic. I think that spirit, even if he fell short, and he did, by his own admission, I think that spirit is a good one. And it will outlive him. And that's what people will remember when they think back of him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. By the way, that exchange with the woman who said Obama's an Arab, that's gotten a certain amount of heat from, for one thing, people who are Arabs. Because if you listen to that part of the exchange, she says Obama's an Arab, and he says, no, ma'am, he's a decent man, as if Arabs aren't decent. I do think if you listen to the whole thing, she starts off by saying, Obama, you can't trust him, he's blah, blah, blah. I think it's plausible that McCain was formulating his answer before she got to the Arab part. I think we should give him the benefit of the doubt on that.
Yeah, I think that's just a really a gross misreading of that. we've all been, and we've probably done it in this conversation, formulating our answers before the question is finished.
Right.
And she was clearly, and this wasn't the only time on the campaign trail. He had not thousands, but he definitely had hundreds of town hall meetings with people, especially in New Hampshire, where he's doing a lot of give and take, and stuff like this came up. It's like, anytime you're at a public event. When I covered the Nader campaign in 2000, there would always be the alt weekly journalist with the gray ponytail who would start the question by, quoting Noam Chomsky. And it's like, what you're getting. Okay, here comes like the 10-minute speech. And Nader would cut it off. And like, even before the person would start, it's like, you have to ask a question. So you're used to these stock characters. She was a stock character saying crazy ass stuff about Barack Obama. And his no ma'am was no, I firmly believe, and I know a lot of people who were there, even in the room, reporters who are pushing back Anna Marie Cox, for example, even right now about this. His no ma'am was about the overall conspiratorial negative picture of Obama, which he rejected, and he continued to reject throughout his campaign. And I think it's really unfair to say, oh yeah, he's saying that. I mean, he doesn't have any history at all of saying that Arabs aren't decent people. That's not where he's coming from, regardless of how much you don't like it.
I thought it would have been great if he had picked up on that and made the second point. I thought one of Colin Powell's finest moments was when people were saying, Obama's a Muslim. No, he's not. Yes, he is. No, he's not. And Colin Powell came out and said, what if he is a Muslim? The point is that we shouldn't care. And that was a great thing to say. But I do think McCain had a lot of, fine moments of the kind you've been alluding to. I know one was, during the Chuck Hagel hearings for the Secretary of Defense, confirmation. Ted Cruz just went flat out McCarthyite and was like, insinuating this stuff about, I think it was North Korea. Like, well, isn't it funny that you are in North Korea and blah, and like, I don't know, painting him as some kind of North Korean tool. And McCain really, really dressed Cruz down. I think he had that. I think he had that genuinely kind of noble streak. Do you think he sometimes crossed the line into unjustified moralism? I mean, that he was a moralistic person as opposed to a merely moral person, and had a sense of himself as, I mean, I sometimes got the sense that he thought he was the last moral person in the world, right?
Yeah. This is tied up with this kind of anger management issues, which he would alternately, cop to and then claim didn't exist, depending on the day of the week. But a lot of times his anger would come right at the moment that he was being criticized, kind of, with some basis. He was pretty nasty to a reporter at the Phoenix New Times, who was a big critic of his, named Amy Silverman, kind of pointing her against a wall and yelling his head off about it. In the POW MIA hearings, granted, there was a lot of crankery on the witness stand by people who believe in what I think are probably conspiracy theories about the number of people left behind. But some of these people are, widows, and he was very in the same kind of high moral dudgeon directed at someone who is suffering. I understand the frustration that led him to that moment, but you might want to handle that differently. Whenever you were on the opposing end of John McCain, especially when he was getting in the high moralistic dudgeon, you did not have a wonderfully high opinion of his morality, his sense of decency, his comity, his bipartisan, whatever. He could be a jerk. Famously also, everyone who worked on Capitol Hill, and I never really have, although I lived in Washington, he was famous for giving these very extravagant gift baskets and flowers and notes after he chewed you out and was really mean and cruel to you. So he had that aspect of the ritual as well. But if you just look at all the different things that he labeled as existential threats to America, if you look at the way he would dress down big business or athletes who would come through talking about steroids, the moralism does wear thin at some point. I mean, the fact that he called Rand Paul, and this is before Rand Paul going to Russia, which is kind of a separate issue, but just for the act of Rand Paul saying, I don't think that we should have a unanimous voice vote supporting Montenegro joining NATO, which I think is a completely defensible position. I say this as literally the only libertarian who's ever supported the expansion of NATO, at least the initial expansion of NATO into the first 4 countries. So Rand Paul doing that was enough for McCain on the Senate floor to say that Rand Paul is working for Vladimir Putin. That's not a nice thing to say. It's not true. There's no bipartisan comedy there. It's actually a pretty nasty and awful thing to say. And you don't have to look very hard in his career to find a lot of those things. And like people who are moralistic everywhere, you will get to a place where your heightened sense of moralism leads you to act in ways that are maybe not immoral but wrong.
Mm-hmm. And I know this isn't exactly the same thing. It's not moralism per se, but I remember a moment in the race against Obama where he was debating Obama, and his just kind of contempt for Obama within a certain realm became evident. I think what it was Obama said something about military matters. And I'm sure, back in McCain's mind was like, who is this guy who's been a senator for a few years to be inheriting control of our armed forces as I've done X, Y, and Z. But I think McCain did some pedantic lecture about the distinction between the word tactical and the word strategic or something, if I'm recalling correctly. But it was just really, he really kind of lost control of himself. It was a little too evident that he held his opponent in contempt.
I think he had frustration on the campaign trail of a couple of things. One is that the media was in love with Obama even more, or close to how much they were in love with him in 99 and 2000. It was very funny to watch him and his surrogates complain that Obama's the media darling. Like, really? Are you really? Yeah. That's what you're going to be complaining about? But there was that. And then also, somehow that election never really became about war in the way that he would have liked. I mean, I think it was on one sense about war in that Obama was kind of seen as an anti-war candidate, and he railed against the excesses of the surveillance state and some other things. I wish that he had followed up on some of those things, more of those things as president than he did. But just in terms of an issue set of the things that people were talking about, it did not dominate. It was the financial crisis ultimately that kind of dominated discussion. But it just generally, it never really took hold. And so without remembering that specific moment, I'm sure and I know that fact frustrated him to no end. And he wanted this election to be about how look, we're in a war. You need a steady hand, someone who really knows what they're talking about, who's been visiting all these countries nonstop forever. As the chair of the International Republican Institute, it just is a foreign policy specialist more than a first-term senator who's kind of, into Chicago politics and doesn't really know what he's talking about. I'm sure this drove him batty to no end. However, it's funny, a lot of people are beating up on him. And you alluded to it earlier about the Sarah Palin pick. And the way that we criticize him for that now is that Sarah Palin, obviously, since the election in particular, became this kind of crazy right-wing figure, caricaturish, populist right-wing figure. I would argue that she wasn't that person at the moment that she was nominated. Like, she discovered that potential fan base there. She was actually a pretty interesting, I think, governor. However, the way that the pick is the least defensible for me, is not that she would become this person, but that the pick gave the total lie to what was supposed to be the value proposition of John McCain, which is that he kept saying, look, you need a serious person, even if you disagree with him, in this time of war, a steady hand, and the commander of chief. I know where everything is, and you need this person. Okay, so if you're an old guy, which he was, an old candidate, with a history of health problems and a father and a grandfather who died young, and this is your value proposition, and you're adding as vice president, like, some rando who just walked on the scene, right, who's in her 40s, who just foreign policy is not her strong suit. To put it lightly, I think that is the area of that pick that is the least defensible over time. And in his latest memoir, he laments that he didn't follow through on his desire to preference Joe Lieberman. Although it should be said that if he had picked Joe Lieberman, I think he would have lost by a lot more than he did.
Yeah, I mean, it's on the one hand true that she exhibited some early political incompetence during the campaign. I mean, she stumbled over questions in a way that led you to think good vetting would have kept her from being the pick. On the other hand, he was behind. He needed to take a little bit of a gamble. And there was a period there that people forget when Democrats were terrified of her. She burst on the scene. She's this attractive woman. She gave a very effective speech at the convention, and Democrats were like, "Oh my God, I hope she screws up." And she did. Yeah. But it wasn't obviously crazy for a little while there.
Yeah. The vetting was not good. It was pretty last minute. And you could have, I think, smoked out some of those flaws in her approach. And part of the reason why he chose her, even if it was not necessarily his first pick, was for what you say. They needed this jolt of energy. They needed this improbable, like, oh, who would have thought he would do that? It's a maverick pick to pick her. And it's also interesting to see and telling, I think, on both of their accounts, Palin's reaction to his death is a statement that is just in gobbledygook. It's very, really? I can't do it justice, but he was patriotic sometimes, but I think he let the swamp get too close to him. I mean, it was negative.
Really?
Ultimately, yes. It was not gracious at all. And his treatment of her in his book and in most of his public utterances was gracious. I mean, he said that he didn't have a lot to criticize her on the campaign, and he didn't regret. He just said he would have preferred Joe Lieberman, but he understands it, and he didn't criticize her. He said that she mostly did pretty well on the campaign. So I think it speaks to two different kind of temperaments, generally speaking. And you're right. This was a Bill Kristol special. It was his initial suggestion, I believe, and it speaks to something that McCain is also part of a problem that's unresolved in our Trump era, which is to say, a lot of people who are kind of never Trump conservatives, or even never Trump non-conservatives, but are kind of part of the DC establishment, have not come to terms with their own complicity in the problem that exists now, the problem of Trumpism, let's say, that they identify maybe even more than I do as a modern problem in our politics. The insincere gestures towards populism when you need it. Well, I'll throw some red meat in that direction of these people. I know it's kind of skeevy to do it, but I need it to win this election right now.
Right.
What does that tell those people? It tells, and as soon as you're safely won your election, you can go back to, as in the McCain case, on the complete the dang defense thing. After he's railing against illegal immigration and he wins the primary, he's back to comprehensive immigration reform and pissing off that same base that he was trying to attract. A lot of these people, and it's not just that. I mean, it's also war. The establishment in Washington was totally in favor of the Iraq War. Has it come to terms with that? John Kasich is a guy who, is probably going to be the biggest Republican challenger to Trump in the 2020 primary season. And he'll get squashed like a bug. He'll be treated as this great guy by the media. Dude wanted a preemptive war against North Korea, wanted a war, us to intervene militarily in Syria, thought that we should do another kind of Gulf war. There was incredibly interventionist on foreign policy. Again, not really examined by the media on those questions because people just don't see that as a problem. The establishment has blood on its hands. The establishment is part of the reason why we have such an anti-establishment moment. And what I would like to see, and I know I'm not going to really get it, in the next few days of kind of national mourning and lamentation that we no longer live in a McCain era, we live in a Trump era, I would like to see more kind of critical self-examination of people, not just about McCain's legacy, but about their own legacy in creating the conditions where people were kind of fed up with the world that they had championed.
Amen to that. And in fact, it goes way back. I mean, you're right. Sarah Palin is a kind of a precursor of Trump, but in terms of the anti-elitism that morphed into full-fledged suspicion of the entire establishment, Dan Quayle is the one who popularized this phrase, the cultural elite, and who was his advisor, Bill Kristol. Yeah. And I mean, this was in like the 80s, and the message was very clear. These coastal elites do not care about you. They're not real Americans. They don't care, And it's to some extent a continuous path, I think, from there to where we are. That's far from the only contributor. And I want to emphasize, I mean, I think just as there's a billion ways the political establishment, probably all of us to some extent, have been derelict in dealing with various issues that have festered and so on. But certainly the theme of anti-elitism that Trump so thoroughly exploits has been part of the Republican playbook for a long time.
I mean, it's the nattering nabobs of negativism was
right. Spiro Agnew's phrase, written by, I think,
Bill Sapphire.
That's right, Bill Sapphire.
Yeah, it's been there. It's definitely been there for a long time. I think what is revealed now under Trump is that is probably the only real glue that's holding together the Republican coalition such as it exists right now. It's animus towards the media. It's something I noticed, I think in 2015, I went to the Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC, in Washington. So young activists come in. It's always kind of a interesting, a freak show. It's a lot of different things at once. And so saw, Carly Fiorina, Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio give speeches, and in every single one of their speeches, and so this isn't even Trump, every single one of those guys' speeches, the single biggest applause line was whenever they went after the media. It is anti-media animus is the thing holding it together. It's not, consistent philosophy about free trade, Lord knows, or any number of issues or fiscal conservatism, any number of issues that used to be rhetorically important. All that's been kind of tossed out the window. But what's left after that is licking up delicious liberal tears, owning the libs, which is gratifying for some people, and it's really, I think, an intellectual dead end at some point. And I also hasten to add that I think a lot of people in the media have been leaning into that, like the perpetuating the cycle and seeing themselves more like as an active opposition in a way that will probably just continue that process rather than
totally
figure out a way to react to that that doesn't that is more kind of successfully engaging with people who are seeking the truth about things.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think it may be that the hostility to the media is such that it wouldn't matter if the New York Times and the Washington Post played it a little straighter and, in covering Trump, and seemed less like anti-Trump periodicals. But for my money, they do seem like anti-Trump periodical. I don't mean they've gone full bore ideological. When Trump got the deal with Mexico on NAFTA, they said it's a big victory for Trump, and they'll say those things. But for my money, they've blown a certain amount of credibility.
I mean, it's part of it is like, democracy dies in darkness. This kind of histrionic self-advertising. And granted, it's a advertising slogan, but they're also consciously getting business out of it. The New York Times gets business out of being seen as heroic champions of the First Amendment in this dark time. Fine, it is business, but understand that to the extent that you're exploiting it for gain, you're also going to be driving off people. And most newspapers are not analogous to the New York Times in that they're not themselves in a competitive newspaper market. So, I mean, it makes sense for the New York Times to be like this because they know there's a Wall Street Journal over here and there's some tabloids doing their tabloid things. But if you're just, one of the last remaining daily papers in the country and you're taking the same attitudes of it, you are just driving off, and like irritating a wide swath of your audience, and in ways that I don't think they've really wrapped their minds around.
So on this issue of, courting anti-elitism, how does McCain rank on that? Does he have because it's intermingled with his personal animosity toward Trump, right? I mean, and who knows how many sources? Well, we know one source where Trump comes out and says, "I like war heroes or aren't captured," which was kind of mind blowing. So there's that. I'm sure there's also the little bit of the sense that I think McCain had with Obama, which is, who the hell are you to be president when I've got this amount of political experience and know the military to boot? But in any event, I think the animosity with Trump is intermingled with the, McCain's stance on these issues of principle. about not denigrating the media gratuitously and not cultivating resentment against our fellow Americans. But what's your take on how McCain trumps on how McCain rates on this set of issues?
I think I mean, one of the chapters in my book is called The Elitist, right? So it's this is where he comes from. He had a common touch just in terms of, if you saw him, in an airport hauling his bag around and you happen to be taking a flight with him, he'd shoot the breeze with you, and it would seem like a pretty normal guy in that sense. But again, his background, his entire life has been hobnobbing with. He was like taking R&R with Johnny Apple of the New York Times before he was ever shot down as a POW. This is where he comes from. These are the people that he knows and understands. His book, his latest one, The Restless Wave, co-written with Mark Salter, is just shot through with absolutely withering takes on the conservative media. Just like Breitbart News this, talk radio that, Rush Limbaugh that. He hates those people, or he hated those people. Always did. Criticize them for dividing people, shouting about immigrants all day long. He has always treated like the populism and the media populism in particular, since the rise of talk radio in the early 90s, with just an undisguised disdain. And there are very few exceptions to that rule. I think he engaged a lot with Hugh Hewitt, who can impersonate an intellectual a lot. I don't mean to say that he's an impersonator, but he comes off as more intellectual, let's say, than 99%.
It's a fascinating character. He accused me of intellectual dishonesty on his show, and then after the commercial break, apologized. He is a smart guy. This is a tangent, but he is smarter than the average populist right wing radio. For
sure. And so McCain liked doing his show and liked a few other places too. But he always had this sense of disdain. McCain, although he sits atop or sat atop the largest machine in Arizona politics. This is what happens, regardless of whether you construct a machine. If you're going to be that involved for so long and keep winning, it's going to accrue around you. Grassroots Republicans in conservatives in Arizona widely loathe him, which is kind of hard to understand. But it's that, and it's not just a sense of he doesn't like Rush Limbaugh and that's bad. It's that they never saw him, come around and go to the Republican committeeman meeting and these kinds of things that one does with your local party. They would see him being feted by the national media, and they would just say, okay, well, why is he wouldn't even talk to the local reporters? Oftentimes, that was a common complaint there. So he has this sense of elitism, for good and for ill, just as a purely descriptive thing, has been part of him for forever. It's always been part of his role.
And I think, in fairness, so this is maybe another case where you can clearly see the roots of something laudable in his background, as tends to be the case with people. So one reason he is anti-elitism is because he hung out with elites. That said, he is more broadly against national divisiveness. You suggested that he doesn't like denigrating immigrants, for example, right? There is a larger theme there, right?
Sure. He early on in his career, there was, I believe, a Filipino American named Frank Gamboa at the Naval Academy who was being bullied by someone. And McCain right then was on the verge of being kicked out if he got X number of demerits more. That was it for his career. And I believe an upperclassman was giving this guy grief, probably using some language that would wound our ears in modern times. And McCain kind of famously stuck up for him at that moment. Frank Gamboa never forgot. That's always been part of where he's coming from. And a lot of his book is kind of like Jeff Flake's book. It's kind of a cri de coeur of we shouldn't be this sort of demonizing divisive Republican Party. We should be inclusive. It's really one of the more full-throated defenses of immigration and just a decency towards immigrants that you can see from Republican for a while. So yes, that's always part of it. He also in his hyper kind of Teddy Roosevelt moments in the late 90s used it in a different way. He used it to say, I'm sick of hearing about all these hyphenated Americans, or at least he was highlighting that as a laudable aspect of Teddy Roosevelt's career that he didn't want there to be people thinking of themselves as fill-in-the-blank Americans. It's like we're all Americans. Teddy Roosevelt was, I think, very arguably a racist, and has, I mean, he wrote the history of the Aryan peoples on the earth. I mean, he had a really weird career here, and there wasn't a lot of self-examination about that, among McCain when he was in his full Rooseveltian period. And again, he was lauding those phrases that we shouldn't have these hyphenated Americans. Back then, in the late 90s, there was a lot of concern that about Republican concern, and this was very neoconservative at the time too, about balkanization, about multiculturalism, that this is a bad thing. So McCain danced in that direction a little bit in that time. You haven't seen a lot of it since, and I don't think that's really intrinsic to who he is. You'll see a lot of people disparaging him, criticizing him, I should say, it's a better word, for using words like gook, slopehead, things like that in his memoir, Faith of My Fathers, allegedly or reportedly in some language after he came back, and tried to say from that he's a literal anti-Asian racist. I probably give him more benefit of the doubt than they do on that. 5.5 years of capture is one thing. Also, military culture and the realities of war. War is a horrible thing. One of the things that you do in war is that you immediately dehumanize your opposition. That's just one of the many awful prices of doing it. I don't think that he woke up in the morning thinking that this group of people is lesser by dint of their nationality. And I think actually, in many senses, even though, yes, he supported wars that ended up hurting nationalities, I think that he was motivated, and we should always be interested in people's motivations as well as the results of their actions. But I think he was motivated by a genuine empathy and sympathy for people in faraway places with funny-sounding names. I would just argue that too often his activities based on that empathy and sympathy didn't necessarily help them or didn't necessarily help the world.
Right. Okay. Well, just in closing, anything you want to say by way of, to the extent that you don't think it's clear already, why your book is called McCain, Myth of a Maverick, what the myth part is?
The myth, it has a lot to do with just the way that we talk about him. Yes, he was mavericky, certainly from an early time as a teenager. He was a maverick in the context of his times. A lot of his most notable moments came when he defied his own party's position on something, or when he just acted like someone you wouldn't expect out of central casting politician. It exists, but the mythology around him was pervasive. My book is a piece of media criticism in large sense as much as anything else. It boggled my mind that someone who had already been a serious presidential candidate, and at the time of the release of my book, which is in the fall of 2007, his campaign had gone down, it was coming back up again, was again becoming a serious presidential candidate. You can count on one hand, maybe two, the actual serious treatments of his governing ideology. This is a persistent problem in political journalism in general, and it was a particular problem with John McCain by dint of his dazzling biography, for sure, but also because some of his aspects of his ideology are ones that are shared and also unexamined by the press itself. So a default setting for government intervention, either in other people's in other countries or in domestic affairs as well. And people mistake kind of a pragmatism, a sort of do something approach to the world as lacking in ideology, when in fact it is inherently ideological. It's saying that the government needs to do something about this problem right away, and we'll figure out what that is later. I mean, his behavior, for instance, during the financial crisis is very well predicted. If you know that he's coming from this kind of do something default setting, what did he do? He again suspended his campaign showily so he can go to Washington and help with the problem, but he had nothing useful to contribute to it. In fact, he was talking about nationalizing mortgages at some point. He really didn't know what he was talking about. He didn't have a strong kind of a sense of economics.
Yeah, that was a very damaging moment for him.
It was if you look at the political science of what were the issues that drove the election, arguably the biggest single issue is that a strong majority of Americans trusted Barack Obama with the economic crisis and not John McCain. I think one of the reasons is not only did he just come off as like not knowing what he was talking about, he just didn't come up with any kind of clear alternative. He just came back and said, well, we need to vote for TARP because TARP is something. When I think there's an excellent case to be made that there are other ways to approach that problem. He didn't take that, but if someone with that kind of ideology, again, this was largely unexamined at the time by the political press. So if in his death, in our remembrances, yes, we should remember him in his full, complicated self, and come on with the critical examination, which he invited, and much to his credit, and the people around him have always invited. But part of that, I think we should also examine, the way that we all in media and elsewhere, treat, our own approaches kind of to issues and realize our deficiencies in not identifying that there are ideologies, even in our own behaviors and certainly in the behaviors of the politicians that we talk about.
Okay. Well, Matt, thanks for taking the time. People can read your stuff at Reason. They can read your book on John McCain, Myth of a Maverick. And where can they find you on Twitter?
Just at Matt Welch.
That's easy. And not that you ask, but they can find me at Robert Writer. It's a pun.
Love it.
Love it. I knew it would meet with your approval. Well, thanks again. Let's not wait another however many years it's been before you come back.
I would love that, and thank you very much for having me. It's been a very
my pleasure. Great conversation. Thanks.